And I'm going to give a quick run through from my experience and the experience of the organization that I work with on how Akoma Ntoso is transforming legislative drafting and sort of the experience and the stories that we've encountered with the work we've done with Akoma Ntoso. And also feel free to ask questions in the chat at any time or at the end if there's time. So first things first is going to be hello from Xcential. Xcential is the name of the organization, the company that I work for as a senior legal analyst. I have a background in law, and obviously with the past decade of focus mostly in legislation. But Xcential really is a group of specialists in legal informatics and legislative technologies. We're based in San Diego, California, but we have employees and consultants all over the world from coast to coast in Canada. I'm located in Eastern Canada, the United States from coast to coast as well, and Europe. We're a small company, but we have worked with legislatures, governments, regulatory bodies from around the world. And we essentially focus on helping governments design and build modern tools for drafting and managing legislation. I would say that the groups that we've worked with are the United States House of Representatives, publishing offices, and worked on projects worldwide from the UK, Hong Kong, Chile, in California, Washington, Eastern Canada. So it's really a global reach, and that's the interesting part of working with Akoma Ntoso, which I'll get into. And again, I'm not sure of everyone's familiarity with Akoma Ntoso and exactly what it is and what it's used for. So the first things first, it's not always easy to know how to pronounce it. And it took me a while to get used to it as well. So we pronounce it Akoma Ntoso, but you will often see AKN as an abbreviation, or also legal doc ML, which is the, I suppose, official standards name for it. And essentially, the symbol that you see here, the white symbol in the top of the page, is actually the Akoma Ntoso symbol, and it means linked hearts. And what you see here, the symbol that you see depicts 4 linked hearts together that embody agreement and unity. And Akoma Ntoso began as an initiative at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs in 2006. And since then, it's been developed through the stewardship of a dedicated working group. And for the past several years, it's been refined to become the Akoma Ntoso standard. So inside of this legal doc ML technical committee of the standards body. And a bit more about it, it's what we call a vocabulary for modeling the structure of most documents found in most legislative processes. And I guess the simplest way of putting it is that the XML defines a set of rules for encoding documents in a format that's both human and machine readable. And we'll take a bit of a closer look as to what this means in practice in a pretty constrained circumstance, but we'll see, it'll give you sort of a visual idea of what that actually means for legislative drafting. It's a standard that's been adopted by several parliaments, jurisdictions internationally, the Italian Senate, the European Parliament to a certain extent, Chilean Library of Congress, I believe, also for certain sets of documents, law reports, the UK National Archives. There is a derived version of it being used for the United States Code. I believe UN agencies are using it as well. So it's something that's becoming more and more used internationally, which is its base purpose. And is getting wider and wider adoption as organizations begin to see the value of working with something that is a standard. And for the purpose of what I'll talk about today, it's essentially a standard for building rulemaking systems. And standards are something that I believe Sylvia talked about a few minutes ago, and we hear people talk about a lot. Oh, sorry about that. I went too quickly. And standards are crucial in a digital world, in a connected world. They're crucial in the world in general. They're important for basic functioning of the world, and there are tens and thousands of standards. And the Akoma Ntoso standard was vetted by the Organization for Advancement of Structured Information Standards, so OASIS, which is a nonprofit consortium that works on the development and the adoption of open standards for structured information, which means it goes through an evaluation process, an adoption process, and so on. So it is a vetted standard that has received international adoption. And that's very important when we think about what it's going to be applied to, why we're going to use it. And the technologies that the Akoma Ntoso standard adopts, which are namely XML technologies, which we'll look at a little bit more closely, have been around a long time. It's really the standard part that's relatively new for legislation and legal documents. And before, when governments and jurisdictions were using this type of encoding or XML for drafting legislation, they were more in-house schemas that were built for punctual purposes. And then often you'd see sort of different standards being used within governments, which would make exchange of information difficult, and it would perpetuate things like information silos. What we're looking at here is a standard that's really jurisdiction and tradition independent, that's designed to be flexible and really apply to the maximum number of use cases that might exist. Why are standards a big deal? There's a few reasons. And I'll go through these really quickly, but they are all really important. They're technology platform agnostic, which basically means that much in the way that HTML can be displayed in any browser, the idea is that something that's created with the Akoma standard can be used with specific or with a wide set of tools. They aren't attached to a specific vendor or a generation of technological tools. This standard belongs to everyone, which means that we can also have wider information exchange and integration, and open market for building legislative tools, applications, system to develop these, both open source, and there are open source tools for drafting and for creating documents, Akoma Ntoso, but also vendor supported tools, which is the case that I'm in, where we have an organization, a company that has built a tool for managing legislation using an open standard. So this is the marketplace and the ecosystem that really becomes opened up when we talk about having standards like Akoma Ntoso in the legislative domain. When we think about it as well, standards are important because they help reduce the cost of implementing legislative technologies, partly because you have this wider marketplace of tools, of vendors, of open source communities as well that are contributing to this and building their own tools that we can reuse. And that also contributes to the easier reuse of information, and also permanent. And permanent is important because nobody owns this format. It's not, for example, if you purchase a book or a Kindle book on Amazon that you'll read in your Kindle reader. It's just one example. We're talking about a standard that can be used in a variety of different tools and that nobody owns. And that's important for the permanence and the ability of those documents to outlast any technological tools you might use to work with them. And fundamentally, what we're going to look at is standards like can allow us to build not only a wide marketplace of tools, but truly specialized tools for drafting and managing legislation. And this is far beyond what many general purpose word processing tools are capable of. And what these specialized tools are going to do is help manage and automate some of the most challenging aspects of drafting, updating, and managing legislation. So as you know, full disclosure, we build these kinds of tools, but like I said, it's not just us. There are lots of organizations and governments that build these tools as well. And that's what's neat. It truly feels like we have a growth of an ecosystem of interoperable applications. And Akoma Ntoso is more than a schema in that sense. It's really a community of practitioners who work towards building these systems. And as this standard gains acceptance, that community is going to grow. And as that community grows, we're going to start thinking about dramatically lowering the cost and the risk of building legislative systems. So this is something that's really important to consider when you think of how we approach modernizing legislation and our approach to legislation. And that's something that's very important. Now, when we think about it, why would we build specialized rulemaking systems? If you think of law and legislation as text on paper, it might not seem immediately evident. But if we take a step back and zoom out and think about it, do software developers write and manage code using word processors or basic file managers? Do engineers and architects model their designs using generic mainframe computers? They used to, but for the most part today, they don't. And with that being said, why would we let legislation, which essentially is the entire operating system for a jurisdiction, be drafted, managed using generic or general purpose tools? And yes, including paper in that because that still exists and is quite widespread. And if you think about it, I work extensively with software developers, and they use highly specialized editors, version control systems, repositories for managing software, for drafting engineering documents, as do engineers and architects use computer assisted design. So we have to think back and wonder why in so many cases, legislation is still often written using tools that aren't actually designed for legislation. And legislation looks like text, but it's very complex and it's much more than that. It's more than numbered paragraphs and sections. It's really a highly interconnected system of documents or a framework that have both cause and effect. And that's something that's important to consider when we think of how we draft legislation and the tools we use for doing that. Legislation expresses concepts that are difficult for current tools to capture. Think of versioning, which is very complex, layered changes when we come to amendments to bills, for example, complex concepts as well that have a temporal dimension to them, like effective dates or operative dates that might only apply to certain portions of a bill or a piece of legislation. These concepts are really hard to express and capture without specialized drafting tools. And it is hard to customize existing tools to do this. We know this because we tried. And I believe lots of organizations have tried as well. So I think one of the important things when we think of how standards and how Akoma Ntoso can really transform legislative drafting is to think beyond paper. And that's hard to do because the way that legislation is drafted and enacted really hasn't changed that much in the past several decades, arguably more than that. And we went, for example, from pen and paper, we went to typewriters, we moved to mainframes. I'm probably skipping over some. We've moved to word processors as well, which is something that we see quite commonly. But none of these tools were designed for drafting legislation in a digitally enabled world. And we've really done things relatively the same way. And that's partly a luxury, but partly made it very difficult to think of change today. We're still working within this paradigm of print technology and printed artifacts. Legal texts as we know them today are usually conveyed in a natural or written language. They're not meant for computer processing. They're meant to be interpreted by institutions, by courts, by lawyers, human consumptions, and paper publication. But they are part of a larger ecosystem, and they do have consequences far beyond the piece of paper that they're often published on or the PDF that they're published on. So it's important to think beyond paper. Legislation is not just a document, it's much more than that. It's a set of rules, it's a set of instructions, it's information, and those different sections or provisions of a piece of legislation, whether it's primary or secondary, is essentially important information. And what we want to do is start thinking about legislation as not just data, but essentially legislation as information. And the idea behind this was to create tools that are specialized specifically for the use case of legislation. And I'm giving you an example here. This is the tool that we've built. There are several others, and I really encourage you to go out there and look at this ecosystem of tools that exist for managing legislation. And essentially, what does that mean in practice? What do we mean when we talk about drafting using Akoma Ntoso? And I have on the left-hand side of the screen sort of an under the hood and an above the hood. It's actually the very same information that you see, but two different views into that information. And I'll just zoom in on this part here, the under the hood bit. So if you zoom in on it, what you're essentially looking at are tags or information here that are effectively describing the data. So we see that we have a clause, we see that it's got a specific identifier. In this case, we see that we're looking at a definition, terms and definitions that relate to each other explicitly. So when I say under hood, that's what I mean. This is Akoma Ntoso on the left-hand side, but it's also Akoma Ntoso on the right-hand side. And what you're looking at is one of those paradigms that's difficult to sort of dismantle because we are looking outside of a paper paradigm and looking into the fact that what's under the hood is styled very differently from what we see on screen. I mean, that's one of the major differences that we look at when we're drafting with Akoma Ntoso and standards. we're looking at the ability to separate the document content, so the information we want to communicate, from its presentation, so what it actually looks like. And there are lots of different XML editors, many of them, dozens of them, but very few are really designed with the specific challenges of legislation in mind. And that was just a preview of what a drafting tool might look like using Akoma Ntoso. So if we think of legislation as digital information, what do we mean more specifically? I mean, I'll go through this quickly. It means improved drafting. And I mean improved drafting in the sense that we have the opportunity to incorporate automatic numbering and renumbering of provisions and internal cross-references, which for legislative drafters, especially with large pieces of legislation, is something that's incredibly valuable because it is time-consuming. We are able to draft amendments in context and generate amendments, create document comparison tool, think about tagging with taxonomies and ontologies, which is something that, that we've worked with as well, automated consolidation and compilation, or semi-automated in some cases. We improve the codification and the codification experience as well. Point-in-time lookup as provisions. So for example, if you want to know what the definition of organic standards was in July 2015, you'd be able to do that because that information is embedded within the Akoma Ntoso markup. And also multi-channel publishing, often from a single source document. So you can produce your PDF, you can produce a web page without necessarily applying any manual formatting and styling to that. And I'll give you a quick preview of what this means, particularly in a few of these high value use cases. You look at the ability to auto draft amendments from proposed changes. So on the left-hand side, I have an example of a regulation that has track changes to it. And from those track changes, we're able to extract amending instructions that correspond to the changes in the base document. So what we're doing is really flipping the process around and generating amendments from changes tracked to a base document. And this is the importance of that embedded encoded information, that semantic tagging that's telling the editor or the machine that, well, you're amending a section, you're amending a definition. Here is the amending instruction that corresponds to those track changes you're making in the base document. We also have things like advanced change management, which is an example that you see here, where we can layer changes on top of each other, which is essentially what's happening in the legislative process. The example that you see on screen here is for a jurisdiction that amends in full. So the statute being amended is laid out in full, and the changes to it are shown directly with the track changes. Now, when that bill is amended, if that bill is amended, which it usually is, those changes can often be layered over existing changes. And that's something that's hard to demonstrate. And a lot of generic tools don't do out of the box or don't do very easily. So here's an example of being able to layer those changes and extract different sets of amendment based on different types of changes you can identify, which is what you see here on the left side of the screen, the different colored change sets, so the green and the gold. And finally, other things that we can do is advanced document comparison, which is an example of what you see here. And the reason for that is that bills or legislation is often recycled, and bills are often similar to bills that were previously introduced or have passed through legislatures at different points in time. So when people are reviewing legislation, they often want to know which ones are similar to the one they're looking at, or maybe to the request that they've received for a bill sponsor. So being able to build tools like that is something that standards like Akoma Ntoso allow us to do. And here's an example of what you see on screen, where we have tools that allow you to see specific changes in a bill. And this is more than just a difference, because we have complicated use cases in legislation, like provisions that were split, or a provision that's moved somewhere else within a bill. In general change management, you'll see that as struck out, but you won't necessarily see where it went in the bill. So these are the use cases that we can think of in this specific legislation use case. The big picture, we're looking at the importance of standards for drafting legislation means more than just drafting. We talk about creating open and searchable data systems, improving automation and workflow, improved, and I'd love to see one day, bulk publication of legislative data, high quality information for data consumers, which means improved transparency, but also improved compliance. Because that data is consistent, it's available, it's standardized, this makes compliance efforts more easier for organizations who have that as a concern. We can also start thinking of rules as code applications that are being built using this standard format for legislation. And a big picture consideration that I think is also really important is bringing legislative drafting and law school curricula into the 20th century to start introducing the thought of legislation as data, as digital information to students, because it's something that's truly important. And essentially that's all for me. And does anyone have any questions, comments, or thoughts? I did go through it quickly, but by all means.